From Eyewitness News, this is Newsmakers.
Few people have been more involved in the charter school movement in Rhode Island than Lieutenant Governor Dan McKee. Now charter schools are under the gun. Their funding is facing scrutiny at the State House. Our guest on the first half of Newsmakers, Lieutenant Governor Dan McKee. Then, one local freelance journalist is taking on the U.S. Department of Justice in an attempt to peel back the curtain on a major drug case. Our guest on the second half of Newsmakers, Philip Eil.
Welcome to Newsmakers. I'm Tim White. Joining me on the program, as always, WPRI.com reporter Ted Nesi. And Governor, welcome back to the show. It's good to have you.
It's great to be here.
Before I get emails, that is the proper way to address you. I always get emails. He's the Lieutenant Governor. Governor, when you're referring to you, is
Governor,
the proper way to
Dan's just as good.
Okay, well.
And we apologize if we say mayor.
Yes.
We're still used to it.
Yes. All right, I want to start with education and charter schools. It's clear charter schools will be back on the table at the General Assembly this session as they scrutinize the funding formula. There are lots of questions from lawmakers about funding, that charter schools may get too much, and signals are that there may be a push to stop charter school expansion. Do you feel that charter schools are under attack? In other words, how concerned are you that there will be legislation that would stifle the charter school movement?
Well, first, I'm in favor of great public schools. And I see that charter schools are a piece of that puzzle, you know, a piece of the whole system. I don't see it as a parallel, as the excuse that's being used is we can't afford to develop parallel systems. Just by very definition, if you go back to your geometry, parallel lines run side by side to one another and they don't touch. Well, first of all, mayoral academies represent about less than 1.5% of the student population in the state of Rhode Island. It's not a financial threat. So, the whole approach here is disturbing because it's a hoax, and it's built on untruths, half-truths, and
what do you mean it's a hoax? Because the argument here is money follows the student,
yes.
Right? So if the same amount of money of a kid going to a Providence public school goes to a charter school in Providence, the argument is charter schools have less overhead, and you can't argue that. They don't have pensions. So why is that a hoax?
Well, not all. Most of your charter schools are in the state pension, and
mayoral academies.
The mayoral academies
right?
are not in the state pension, but they pay for the Social Security. They have the Social Security expense, and they're into a 401k. The only difference between the mayoral academy and the state pension is one solvent and the other one isn't.
So do you think they have the same overhead, a charter school?
Very similar. Yeah, very similar overhead
with athletics and everything.
Well, there's some things that are different, and that should be adjusted. But to think that funding formula was not a godsend to every community in the state of Rhode Island, whether you're urban or suburban, millions of dollars, new dollars, have entered into communities like Providence and Pawtucket and Woonsocket, Cumberland,
Bristol
Lincoln.
Warren will disagree with you on that.
Bristol Warren, that's right, but that's because they were receiving far more than what they were entitled to when they received $6,000 a student, when a community like Lincoln or Coventry was receiving maybe $3,000 a student because of an old, antiquated foundation.
But back to charter
formula.
schools, would you be willing to see a funding haircut to charter schools to preserve?
I think there's areas where I think there's going to be recommendations. I've read some of the recommendations that have come out of RIDE yesterday or the day before, and it makes sense to talk about special needs students. When we wrote the report and 70% of the municipal leaders signed on to the funding formula, fixed the funding formula in the state of Rhode Island, we're the ones who drove the funding formula that benefited the communities to the degree that they have. So yes, we actually were advocating at a time that special education should be a standalone strategy, and that should be dealt with. But we also advocate for the fact that kids that are going to any public school, which includes a mayoral academy or a charter school, they also should be treated fairly as a student in a district school in terms of the housing aid, and that's not happening right now. So there's some balancing that can go on, but it makes sense to keep on trying to make it good.
Just remind people, in this context, housing means school buildings, not homes
right.
where
Yes,
people
live. Yes.
One idea, when I was up at the State House Tuesday for the start of session, one idea it sounded like it's percolating among lawmakers is perhaps somehow allowing charter schools, if they get local school committees to buy in and authorize them or authorize their students to go, because of course they're always now complaining that it busts their budgets to have their students go to charters. What do you think of that idea?
Well, it'll kill the innovation that are in the charters. And like I was saying before, look, we represent less than 1.5 of the students that go to schools in the state of Rhode Island. Yet we have figured out how to approach Massachusetts levels in terms of education. So my concern is not only academic, but it's also economic. If we reached Massachusetts levels in education, well, so they're 1 to 3 on different testing on math and reading, we're 30th, right? But if we reach that level, it's worth about somewhere between $1.5 billion and $2.2 billion into the pockets of the working families of the state of Rhode Island, just as a result of achieving those levels. So there's a lot more at risk here. If you just stop the very innovations that are helping drive the change, you do risk an economic issue. Just to reduce it to the ridiculous, Tim. $40 million a week on a working day. $1 million an hour of earning power if we can reach Massachusetts levels. And right now, if you did a map and you did blue for every district that's in Massachusetts, and you did red for every district that's in Rhode Island, you would see a sea of blue above the sea of red. Across the board, low income, non-low income, Hispanic, white, black. So there's an awful lot at risk here.
But do you see
it's designed, excuse me, but it is designed to shut down the mayoral academies. That's the hoax that I'm talking about. And if we fall for it, economically, we're going to pay a big, big price.
So is your concern just, you keep mentioning the mayoral academies separate from the charters. Is your concern mostly with the mayoral academies, not other charters?
We know the target is the mayoral academies, because legislation initially on that that local control was strictly on mayoral academies. I don't know if they actually have filtered in the, they don't want the mayors involved. The people who are running the schools, they want to tell you as media, and they want to tell the public that sea of blue and that sea of red doesn't exist. And that the fact that we can do better because we are showing ways both in the charter schools and in some of the district schools and primarily in the mayoral academies where we're achieving at higher levels and we're approaching Massachusetts levels.
Do you see any validity to the complaints of school committees about funding and how the charter schools impact their budgets?
In the circumstances we discussed earlier, which was some of the special ed issues, some of the other issues where there might be not as much, but it's marginal. It's not as large as they're saying. We know in the districts of Cumberland and Lincoln, which are mayoral academies, the most heavy suburban districts, we just ran $1 million surplus in our school department. $1 million on top of multiple surpluses both in Cumberland and Lincoln. So it's not having this dramatic problem in terms of expenses. And what are we at risk here? We're at risk, during this show alone, this half-hour show, if we were hitting Massachusetts levels, which we believe we can, our working families, both union and non-union, would earn $500,000. So this is a real important economic issue when you reduce it right down to that level. And people who are trying to protect their territory, do they have a right to protect their territory at the expense of the economy of the state of Rhode Island?
Ted said this before the show, and I agree with him, that what we just talked about would be the dominant issue up at the General Assembly if it weren't for tolls. So I want you to weigh in on that right now. That is the hot topic. Where do you fall? Do you support the governor's roadworks plan as a whole, including the borrowing? Or would you like to see some tweaks, some changes to it?
So I think that no one can disagree that there's a need for the infrastructure improvement and that there's not a revenue source that currently is sitting there. The governor, I give her credit to come forward with a plan that she believes that she can create the revenue that can start to do these programs, come up with a better idea. I haven't heard one yet.
Ideas have been thrown out there from the
GOP
and from the
Well, the
Truckers
GOP, look,
Association.
I ran into the same thing on budgets in the town of Cumberland, Tim. So someone would come up and say, hey, you got a $90 million budget. It should be easy to find $1 million. And I say to them, all right, so you identify to me either the revenue source that you increase or you identify to me the expense that you're going to cut. That has not happened in that plan. So if they could actually identify where they can cut a revenue to replace the millions of dollars that you were trying to get every year, then I could listen a little clearer.
Anything in roadworks you don't like?
Well, I think that I would continue to protect ourselves, and I've said this publicly before, in terms of if in fact if there is borrowing that goes on, that we borrow it at the lowest interest possible. And so I would make sure that what we did, and we did 1-year tax anticipation notes to kind of offset short-term strategy, so that if we wanted to borrow on the long term, we could get ourselves the best interest rates. I don't think we should close the door on that, and I don't think we should close the door on ideas that might come forward in this mix that could be better ideas. The governor herself has said that that's an option for us. So, but if you can't find one, you need revenue, and you need to figure it out in a way, to develop that revenue.
There's been talk over the years that maybe someday you would challenge Congressman Cicilline in the 1st Congressional District in the Democratic primary. Would you ever consider that, or will you support Congressman Cicilline for re-election this year?
When our good friend Congressman Kennedy left, there was a lot of thought about me running for that seat at the time. I dismissed that, so that I don't have an interest in that seat. I would support Congressman Cicilline, by the way.
There's a huge battle in Providence going on with the firefighters, and Mayor Elorza and the state's firefighters union has said they're coming back to the State House this year to push legislation. A lot of that might focus on schedules in the wake of what's going on in Providence. I'm wondering if you think the way Providence has handled the situation has made it riskier for other cities and towns, that bills limiting management rights are more likely to get support at the General Assembly because of how Providence handled it.
Well, what we said at the time when we brought one of the things that we're working on, as you know, is municipalities, efficiencies, consolidation, regionalization, which we're making some progress on. And so we brought all the mayors together to say, look to the General Assembly, just very similar to what I say, the hoax that's going around on these parallel systems right now in the education. You're not being told the truth by what's going on, right? That you weren't going to compensate these firefighters if there was additional time. When that actually was found to be true, and I think that Mayor Elorza clarified that. So I don't see that changing, Tim, because the right...
You don't see what changing?
I don't see the municipal leaders changing their position because of anything that's happened in Providence. In fact, what I would say is that...
Yeah, that's not what I'm asking.
Yeah.
What I'm asking you is, do you see more support at the General Assembly for bills that would limit their rights because of how things are going in Providence? Look, no other community that we know of in the country does a schedule like Providence does, and that's been a pretty big issue, and clearly the State Firefighters Union is going to bring that to the General Assembly. Are you worried about that?
No, because it's a right that each community could have, whether they implement it well or not. It's a right that the municipal leaders need, and I don't see that evaporating. I don't see the support for the municipal leaders, especially where we're going to continue to advocate for the taxpayers in each and every community. You walk in my office, you're going to see 39 shields, one for each community in the state of Rhode Island. We're going to continue to advocate for the taxpayers and that live in the communities. And that management right, if that goes away, that potentially could hurt the taxpayers.
It seems dry, but it matters to a lot of people. Yes. Property revaluation.
Yes,
this is every 3 years when they go through in the cities and towns and look again at how much everybody's house is worth, et cetera. You have worked with Senator Walaska and Rep. Hearn on a bill to not do it every 3 years, but to do it every 5 years. It sounds like it would save money. I mean, I guess what's the pushback to that? Why are there reasons not to do it? Why hasn't it passed?
It got very close to passing last year. It got out of the Senate, got to the floor of the House, and then it got delayed. And there are a couple people who are. It's interesting, which I've learned in there is that 1 million people against 3 or 4 people that might potentially lose a little income. You would think that at least they'll be on a level playing field, and we find out that in some cases the 3 or 4 people can actually outweigh the 1 million people. So
who are they?
Who are you? Right.
It's the tax assessor. It's a tax assessor association, but primarily the individuals that do the assessments, right? That are contracted for the work. But interestingly enough, we've really worked very much with Massachusetts. They have a tax appeal board, statewide tax appeal board. We're going to ask that we kind of look at that as a regional strategy that could lower cost and help. And then Massachusetts, like Connecticut's on a 5-year cycle right now, Ted. Massachusetts is considering, but the governor, I'm told, is going to propose to move from a 3 to 5 year. That's going to be a lot easier for us to move to the 5 year. And then we're finding efficiencies that are happening in Massachusetts that could save us. We calculate moving from a 3 to 5 year will save the taxpayer in the state of Rhode Island a little over $1 million a year. And we find that the way that Massachusetts operates with the Tax Appeal Board and the way that they do their internal revals annually and an audit, which they're going to move to a 5-year cycle, actually will save us more money. So we're hopeful that
So
that
it's you
will get
versus the
moving.
assessors.
It's us against the assessors are, which the mayors have talked to the assessors. The assessors, I think, the Tax Assessors Association supported the legislation last year. It was the outliers, it was the individuals that actually do the contracting through the RFPs that.
And you're not hearing anything from any cities and towns that might like to have that option to reevaluate every 3 years so they can potentially bring in more revenue?
In fact, when we met and we had letters that we sent, I think that we had about 75% of the municipal leaders actually sign on to that letter to support the move from a 3 to 5 years, save the taxpayers the $1 million. And there's a lot, being a mayor, I understand that there's a lot of complications, as you said. Every 3 years, it's like every year, to tell you the truth. You have 1 year off, you prepare for the next year, and all of a sudden you're into the next
Like
session.
running for office.
Yes, and my wife and I are very thankful that this is a 4-year cycle, not a 2-year cycle.
Yeah. Lieutenant Governor Dan McKee, thank you very
Yes.
much for joining us on the program. When we come back, taking on the feds, freelance journalist Philip Eil. Stay with us. You're watching Newsmakers. Welcome back to Newsmakers. I'm Tim White. Joining me to my right, WPRI.com reporter Ted Nesi. And our guest on the second half is freelance journalist Philip Eil. And we're going to be talking a lot about government transparency, but this all stems from a battle you're having with the Department of Justice, specifically the DEA.
Right.
With the help of the ACLU, you filed a lawsuit against the Department of Justice. Give us a quick thumbnail of the case.
So my dad went to medical school and college with a guy named Paul Volkman, who is currently sitting in federal prison in southern Indiana for the rest of his life because he was convicted of being one of the most prolific and fatal prescription drug dealers in United States history. DEA initially charged him with prescription drug dealing, and they said he caused the deaths of at least 14 patients. They ultimately convicted him in 2011 after an 8-week trial in Cincinnati. And he received 4 consecutive life sentences, 2 more than Whitey Bulger got. That was in, almost 5 years ago now. I became interested in this a couple of years before the trial, sent him a letter, interviewed him. I was in graduate school at the time. This struck me as an interesting thesis project. It was an interesting thesis project. Then it struck me as a book project. And I've been working on this book now for years, since 2009. But it's been held up because when I went to ask a lot of people for the evidence that was shown during this trial, hundreds of exhibits, 8-week trial, tens of thousands of pages, prescription slips, death certificates, toxicology reports, everything the government used to show that this guy was a drug dealer and not a doctor, everybody told me no. Clerks, judge, prosecutor, and now for years, the Department of Justice.
So is one question I want to clarify for people.
Yeah.
Is the information you want, Phil, is it all stuff that was publicly put forward in the trial, or are you asking for like the evidence collected but not used?
It's an important question, and I am only asking for stuff that was shown to the jury during open trial court proceedings. And it's important to note that none of this stuff, as far as I know, was presented to the jury under any special seal. It was just shown in an open court. Now, a side note, I happen to have been, in a way, ejected from that courtroom because I was subpoenaed and asked to testify in the trial. I was never actually called to testify, which is another major question mark.
That's often a tactic that is used to kick someone out of a courtroom. And at the time you were a graduate student, if you were with the the Tribune or
Right.
something like that,
Right.
their lawyers would step in and stop that. Before we get into what Ted was asking about, the transparency thing, which is what we're here to talk about, I have a question. Is the reason you're embarking on this project because you think Dr. Volkman, who a lot of people will remember this case as the pill mill? That was how it was dubbed. It was like a national story.
Yeah, Chicago news outlet called him the pill mill killer.
And I think some other news outlets picked up on that because it's a sensational way to promote the story,
Right.
which is why I mention it. Do you think Dr. Volkman is innocent?
Not necessarily. I interviewed him. I went to the areas where he was, what he says was practicing medicine. One was an unmarked house on an out-of-the-way street in a down-and-out town in southern Ohio where there was no shingle, where I interviewed the neighbors who told me cars were lining up at all times of the day, people stumbling out of their cars, knocking on their doors, asking, is the doctor home? These, among many other things that I saw personally, were indications that what was going on here was not what anyone would consider reasonable medicine. So no, I'm not trying to bust a guy out of jail. My I became curious because this was a guy who had an MD, PhD from the University of Chicago. How does a federally funded program actually, when he and my father went, how does that guy wind up in federal prison? It was a curiosity thing. It wasn't, here's my dad's old pal, I'm going to go bust him out of jail.
So this isn't serial necessarily. This is more, you thought it was an interesting case, and maybe his story, even if it did turn out he had done something wrong, would be an interesting story.
Exactly. And with that said, I will say that the line between practicing medicine and drug dealing when it comes to treating chronic pain, when it comes to opiates, is much blurrier than the prosecution or the defense would allow in this case. It's actually, highly subjective. It's built on a statute that talks about the legitimate practice of medicine. That's a subjective term. And in fact, in this trial, each side brought out experts who argued about what is legitimate medicine. And I think it's a worthwhile conversation for people to have because, unfortunately, in the years since this trial ended, the prescription drug abuse addiction problem has only gotten worse.
It's an epidemic. And so you're trying to peel the curtain back
Absolutely.
on all this.
In fact, there was a report issued by the White House when the Volkman trial was taking place calling this an epidemic. Mm-hmm. And if anyone had asked, where are these pill mills that are referred to in this White House issued report, somebody could have pointed, it's actually a trial going on in Cincinnati.
So in order to peel the curtain back, what you're asking for, and Ted asked you about the evidence?
Yeah.
This evidence is private medical information, and that's probably, from what I've read, that's the problem you're having here, and they're making an argument. This is private medical information. Why should you, devil's advocate here, why should you or anyone else have a right to someone's private medical information?
I want to be very clear that I'm not saying, your medical information should be published or yours or anyone's. I'm making a point that when you go back to the very founding principles of this country, in the 6th Amendment of the Bill of Rights, it says people get a public trial. And I think any definition of a public trial would mean that anyone, a journalist, a citizen, could A, attend the trial, which didn't exactly happen for me, and B, when the trial ends, see the evidence. I would say especially that's important when the government says someone was the largest physician dispenser of oxycodone in the U.S. from 2003 to 2005, and they send someone away for 4 consecutive life terms. So when medical information becomes evidence in a trial, and there are no measures taken place during the trial to seal that, I think it's very important that the public get access to see literally who we're putting away. When somebody's freedom gets taken away, and I say this in an abstract level, not necessarily because I'm sympathetic to Dr. Volkman, it's really important that we see why that happened.
Why is this a FOIA case, though? I mean, when I go to get evidence in a mob case, let's say I go to federal court, I go to the clerk, I say I want everything that was entered in full as evidence, and I don't want to get too technical, and they give it. So why are you dealing with the Department of Justice?
That's a really good question. I don't think this should be a FOIA case. It was only when I went to the clerk and then went to the prosecutor and then went to the judge. I have a personal letter from the judge telling me no. It was only when a bunch of people said no that I filed a FOIA request. I would have never thought, gee, I'm going to file a FOIA request. I thought, this is evidence that was shown at a trial. Why can't I get this
And
stuff?
it was never sealed?
No, and what's further frustrating is if you look at other districts in U.S. courts, for example, there was a 9/11 co-conspirator case where in the Eastern District of Virginia where they've put all the trial exhibits online. So why is it the trial evidence in one federal district court can go online for all to see, and in another case,
who's the decider here? Was it
at
the
this point,
judge?
It's a federal judge who's handling the lawsuit. I think at any time, somebody high enough in the chain, maybe it's the president, maybe it's the attorney general, can say, this is absurd. Release this evidence. Unfortunately, we're stuck in this litigation, which is, it's an important step, and I'm enormously grateful to my lawyers, Jessica Jewell and Neil McNamara from Nixon Peabody and the Rhode Island ACLU, but it shouldn't have ever gotten here.
Yeah, but the decider, as Ted asked, is a judge, and it's Judge McConnell here at U.S. District Court in Providence. So that was one of the questions I had for you.
Yeah.
Well, why aren't you doing this in Ohio, and mainly to your benefit? First of all, you're going to get a lot of coverage. It was such a high-profile case there, but also, couldn't you have brought it to the very judge who heard the trial, or a judge in that district? Would that have made why here, I guess?
I'm not a legal expert. Why here is because I'm here, and I live here, and I work here, and when I reached out for help, it was to the Rhode Island ACLU, and they said yes, and I'm under the understanding that when you sue the federal government, you can sue them just about anywhere.
Sure.
But a quick point, just back to your medical privacy thing, I will say what's really important to note is despite the fact that the DEA is still fighting me against the release of this evidence, and despite the fact that the Rhode Island U.S. Attorney is their attorney who is taking up that fight on their behalf. Prosecutors, when Volkman was filing his appeal in 2013, they presented some of the most sensitive medical information, a selection of trial exhibits, to the appellate court in 2013, and they published them basically without redaction. So it's very difficult for me to understand legally and logically how they are going to keep fighting me on this when prosecutors themselves have already published some of the most sensitive information. Doesn't make any sense.
45 seconds before we go to Black here, so
Yeah.
why don't you give us an update? Where does the case stand?
We're currently in a discovery period. The lawsuit is, we're just chugging along. I'm hopeful to get an answer soon.
Any effort to settle?
There was an effort to settle, but the stuff that they offered was heavily redacted. They still withheld a bunch of stuff. It didn't come anywhere near what the jury saw, which is what I'm looking for.
Should people follow you on Twitter, Facebook? For
Absolutely.
updates? There you go. You're welcome.
I'll
take it.
I've been yelling you guys now for years about that.
Give your Twitter handle real quick.
At Phil Eil.
All right, follow him if you are interested in this case. For Phil Eil and Ted Nesi, I'm Tim White. We appreciate you watching, and we'll see you next week on Newsmakers.